This video was a Newsbud community exclusive only available to our subscribers. But due to popular demand and the ongoing campaign against HSBC, Newsbud is making an exception and releasing this exclusive video to the public. Be sure to share it far and wide.
Hi, I'm Sibel Edmonds. Whistleblowers are vital for transparency and accountability. As we know, they often are ignored, discredited, or attacked when they come forward with information that their governments consider embarrassing or inconvenient. At Newsbud, we are determined to give legitimate whistleblowers a voice and a platform to get the truth out. Today, Newsbud is pleased to welcome Nicholas Wilson of Britain, who went up against a powerful bank that allegedly cheated 500,000 people, a hostile government, and media that only wanted to look away. Here's his story and the story of HSBC Bank.
HSBC is one of the biggest, politically best connected, and it looks like dirtiest banks in the world. In this special edition of Newsbud, we're going to take a look behind the curtain at HSBC and talk with Nicholas Wilson, a British whistleblower who has fought not only HSBC, but the British government and the British media for 14 years to bring HSBC to book for almost £200 million of fraud they allegedly committed against 500,000 British consumers. Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation banked the British Empire while there still was a British Empire. Now headquartered in the UK and known by its initials HSBC, it's the sixth largest bank in the world, with almost 250,000 employees, over $2 trillion in assets, revenues of 60 billion, and a market capitalization of 100 billion pounds, making it the second largest company on the London Stock Exchange. HSBC is the pride and joy of British banking, and also its shame. By its own admission, it's done a lot of bad things, and according to whistleblowers like Nicholas Wilson, it's done a lot more bad things that it refuses to admit. In Switzerland, HSBC's private banking division allegedly used Swiss banking secrecy laws to hide illicit money on behalf of individuals and governments who were evading taxes, evading sanctions, or engaged in corruption. A whistleblower at HSBC Switzerland, Hervé Falciani, extracted and released 60,000 files on 100,000 clients controlling $100 billion in funds. In the United States, HSBC was implicated in massive money laundering by Mexican drug cartels. In 2012, HSBC got away with a sweetheart deal from Eric Holder at the Department of Justice, a $1.9 billion fine for lax controls, no criminal charges against the bank or individuals, and a deferred prosecution agreement. Holder overrode his own prosecutors, who wanted a guilty plea from the bank based on pretty unambiguous evidence that HSBC executives had actively connived to evade customer vetting requirements so they could launder at least $800 million in cartel drug money. John Cruz, a whistleblower in this case, alleges that HSBC bankers cloned thousands of accounts in the names of legitimate customers and kept them open for a few hours so they could funnel money through the bank while evading U.S. government reporting requirements. HSBC North America was saved from criminal prosecution or worse, like a genuinely massive fine or even getting shut down, by the intervention of the British government. George Osborne, the UK Treasury Secretary, wrote a letter to Ben Bernanke stating that HSBC was too big to fail. When it got to Eric Holder, it turned into HSBC was too big to jail. It is alleged, but not proven, that the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, flew to the U.S. to personally lobby Barack Obama on behalf of HSBC. HSBC was in the news again in a bad way on March 20th, when the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project revealed that HSBC had been the destination for $500 million of ill-gotten gains extracted from Russia through a massive scam known as the laundromat. In the UK, HSBC used its government connections and influence in the media to evade criminal, regulatory, and financial consequences for its misdeeds, and to squelch the efforts of Nicholas Wilson to bring these misdeeds to light. Wilson lost his job, his peace of mind, and almost lost his house in a 13-year fight to get HSBC to own up to what he believes are hundreds of millions of pounds in improper charges to consumers on past due credit card balances, charges that HSBC knew were improper but continued to collect. HSBC was one of Britain's main providers of consumer credit through its household finance subsidiary and through credit cards issued in the names of some of Britain's biggest retailers, such as John Lewis, Dixon's, Currys, PC World, and B&Q. For a period of almost 8 years, HSBC had a contract with its debt recovery solicitors to compensate themselves by simply adding an improper additional fee of 16.4% on past due balances. Nicholas Wilson, who worked for one of those solicitors, knew it was wrong, and he did something. He blew the whistle, repeatedly, for 13 years, without success, until now. Mr. Wilson is with us today to give us an inside look on how HSBC operates on its home turf in the UK. First, Mr. Wilson, could you give us an idea of HSBC's reach into the British government? Judging by the George Osborne letter to Ben Bernanke, the relationship must be pretty close.
Cameron has a long family connection with HSBC. His great-grandfather at the beginning of the last century was the head of HSBC in the UK when they were established in Hong Kong. And in 2010, the Office of Fair Trading here, which was the regulatory body on consumer credit matters, they made an order against the bank to stop adding the charges which I've been reporting. But that happened in November 2010, at the same time that Cameron had decided to make the head of the bank, Stephen Green, a lord and bring him into government as a trade minister. So the OFT order was buried away in a press release. Nobody saw it. Nobody picked it up. Already he had brought an HSBC boss into the government and buried this order, which was against the bank. As you pointed out, Osborne and the Financial Services Authority, which is the predecessor to our now Financial Conduct Authority, were pleading with the Department of Justice not to prosecute HSBC in 2012, when the deferred prosecution agreement was set up. They were terrified of HSBC losing its license, and that's the reason that I'm having such trouble here, because the Mexican drug cartels or Swiss tax evasion and so on, that's to British people, that's offshore and it's exotic. But what I'm talking about happened in the British high street. So it would be very bad news for that to be released. But more significantly, I think an HSBC director is somebody called Jonathan Evans. He used to be the head of MI5. He's now an HSBC director. He's also director of a company called ARC Data Centers, who supply data services to our secret services, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Justice, basically every major government department, they supply data services. So Jonathan Evans of HSBC is probably one of the men with the most availability of people's private data in the UK. Now, when also David Cameron appointed an HSBC director to head the BBC. She still is the head of the BBC. She's the chair of the BBC Trust, which is the top position in the BBC. When he appointed her in 2014, at the same time that she started at the BBC, very quietly, Cameron made Jonathan Evans a lord. So he brought him into the government as well. There's another lord, Lord Janvrin, who used to be the chair of HSBC Private Bank. He also sits on the Lords Committee that oversees the security services. So again, there's a connection with HSBC in the security services in the UK. They've got their finger in every government organisation in Britain.
You uncovered one of the most striking examples of British government ties to HSBC, the selection of Rona Fairhead as chair of the BBC Trust. the state-run British Broadcasting Corporation. Fairhead had been the head of the HSBC Audit Committee at the time of the massive tax evasion scheme revealed by Swiss Leaks and Hervé Falciani, and I'm guessing she needed shifting to a job that was outside of HSBC, but would also keep her well paid and happy. Mr. Wilson, tell us how Rona Fairhead got her job and what happened to the BBC after she took over.
Well, she didn't give up her job at HSBC, and incidentally, she was actually the head of the risk committee in the United States at the time of the Mexican drug cartel money laundering. She was the head of the risk management when they were fined to $1.9 billion. So, but what happened was normally for government procurements, the procurement was the appointment of the chair of the trustees of the BBC. Normally for government procurements, they have to advertise it, and there's a government website where they advertise jobs for the government. Well, in this case, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, because the BBC, the head of the BBC is a government appointee, basically Cameron. They invited some, apparently, although I've never seen proof of this, but they told me that they invited eight firms to tender for the work. But within 10 days of that invitation to tender, they had sifted all the offers out, and they had fulfilled a contract. The contract is dated on a bank holiday, on a Saturday of a bank holiday weekend, so nobody works at that time. So within 10 days, they had finalised the whole contract, and the contract went to a company called Saxton Bamfield, where the head of the BBC, the Director General of the BBC, Tony Hall, his wife Cynthia Hall is a partner at Saxton Bamfield. And they paid them £36,000 to apparently recruit Rona Fairhead, which was the maximum price awarded under the tender documents. But the whole thing was a setup. It was, and since Rona Fairhead has started at the BBC, there's been virtually no reporting at all of HSBC crimes. I've been documenting it on my website. All the major incidents around the world are not reported by the BBC, and they even lie about headlines that do involve HSBC. For example, there was The Sun is our biggest selling tabloid newspaper, and one day on the front page of The Sun there was a story about an HSBC training day when HSBC staff dressed up as terrorists and pretended to behead an Asian colleague. They were pretending to be an ISIS execution, but the person being executed was an Asian colleague, and it was on the front page of the Sun. But the BBC News report, where they reviewed the daily papers, said that the front page story of the Sun was about Sunday shopping. So they actually, give misinformation about bad stories about HSBC, and it still goes on. She's now resigned from the board of HSBC, but she's still the head of the BBC, and they're still. I mean, this thing you mentioned in the news yesterday, the Russian drug money laundering. There's been virtually nothing on the BBC website about it.
The BBC is not the only British media outlet that felt the heavy hand of HSBC. Peter Oborne resigned from the British paper The Telegraph with a public letter describing how the Telegraph had spiked about half a dozen negative stories on HSBC, including one developed by its own investigative team over 3 months, because HSBC was, quote, the advertiser you literally cannot afford to offend. Mr. Wilson experienced the regulatory and media reach of HSBC firsthand as he struggled to bring the HSBC overcharge issue to the public's attention. Mr. Wilson, could you go into the details of how you blew the whistle on the overcharges and what happened to you in the regulatory arena?
Well, yes. Originally, I worked for a firm of solicitors, which is how I knew about this illegal charging, and I told the bank in 2003 that what they were doing was illegal, and then I reported my firm to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, who upheld my complaint and agreed that the charges were illegal, but they took no action. They said it only happened in a small number of cases. I then reported it to the FSA, as it was then, the Financial Services Authority, like your SEC, and then they did nothing. And then they became the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. So I did a Freedom of Information Act request to the Financial Conduct Authority, asking them what action they'd taken. And the reply they sent me was a copy and paste of a text that HSBC had also sent to a third party, who's Joel Benjamin, who's a financial campaigner. So I caught them out. Basically, the FCA and HSBC were colluding together to answer my Freedom of Information Act request, which is a formal request under an Act of Parliament. And they just lied. They said that they were entitled to add these charges. And the Office of Fair Trading Order actually said exactly the opposite. You must not add these charges until you've changed your terms and conditions. So I complained against the FCA. It went to the Complaints Commissioner. He upheld my complaint. They admitted that they called it an error of judgment, this collusion. It was an error of judgment. No malice was intended. They apologized, paid me compensation, and agreed to reopen the investigation. And we'll talk later about the results of their new investigation.
Mr. Wilson, was your whistleblowing motivated by financial gain or the desire to avoid prosecution? And why is your website called Mr. Ethical?
Oh, well, if it was motivated by financial gain, I've failed spectacularly because I've lost everything. And as I think you've mentioned, I nearly lost my house earlier this year. And I've been unemployed basically since I was sacked for whistleblowing, and I've basically been unemployed ever since. I'm called Mr. Ethical because when I was working at this firm of solicitors, I used to complain about the contract. I refused to do the work, and they referred to me as Mr. Ethical. I had this ongoing dispute with them about the illegal contract. So I was dubbed Mr. Ethical by the firm, so I've kept the name. It's tongue-in-cheek, really. But I can't be prosecuted. I haven't done anything illegal. And that's the problem, in a way, that they've got. I mean, I would love them to sue me. I would love a public forum where all these facts could come out, because they are so damaging to everybody involved, the government, the regulators, the banking system. But they wouldn't. It's the Streisand effect. They wouldn't dare sue me. But I've done nothing illegal.
When whistleblowing cost Wilson his job and the government ignored him, Wilson tried to take his story to the press. And what happened then, Mr. Wilson?
Well, basically, I mean, journalists in good faith, very many journalists have taken an interest in the story, but it's always been spiked by the editors and newspaper, television channels as well. So I've had stories investigated and spiked by Private Eye, Sunday Times, BBC, Panorama, BBC Newsnight, Channel 4 News. The list is endless, but I think one of the worst examples was the Sunday Times were looking into this. Their Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Harper, was looking into this before the election when David Cameron was re-elected in 2015. And the story would have been very damaging for Cameron because it discussed his cover-ups at the time of Stephen Green. But at the time that he was investigating, this journalist was investigating, the editor of the Times, Camilla Cavendish, had a meeting at Cameron's country residence, Chequers. The story was spiked the day before it was due for publication, with no explanation given to me whatsoever. It was just withdrawn. 2 months later, it was announced that Camilla Cavendish was working at number 10 Downing Street in the policy office of David Cameron. And then when Cameron resigned recently, he gave her a peerage. She's now Baroness Cavendish. But so that she buried this story which would have ruined Cameron, and he elevated her. Within a year, she was made a Baroness. That's what's going on in the UK. That's the extent of the corruption.
Well, apparently in January of this year, there was a happy ending. HSBC voluntarily agreed to pay £4 million in redress for the improper charges. So Nicholas Wilson's whistleblowing was publicly vindicated. Is this the end of the story, Mr. Wilson?
No. It was nice to have my story vindicated because I've been insulted and called a conspiracy theorist for years and years and years. But most of the insults have come from journalists, I hasten to add. particularly broadcast media journalists. I've been accused, eccentric, obsessive, vain, you name it. I've been called everything. So it was nice to have vindicated, but the problem is it's another cover-up. The true figure for redress, they've agreed to pay $4 million in redress. The true figure, according to evidence which I have recently presented to the FCA and to the Serious Fraud Office and to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, within the period they're discussing, 2003 to 2009, my evidence shows that over £200 million in illegal charges were added to accounts. Now, they won't all have been paid, but I estimate that probably 40–50% will have been paid. So the true figure for redress is probably more like 80 to £100 million. And I presented this evidence, which is irrefutable. The fact is, the SRA and the FCA and the SFO could all have had access to this information, which was sent to me anonymously. It's a huge database of county court judgments throughout the period we're discussing. So it's public record information, which proves what the figures that I'm talking about. So I'm sitting waiting for them to once again reinvestigate it and come up with a more honest answer.
Wilson has documentation provided by a sympathetic source of court judgments against over 100,000 HSB customers who couldn't pay their bills and were taken to court by HSBC's solicitors. The judgments in the court cases Wilson has access to represent improper collection fees of approximately £30 million. In other words, the British government's own court records document judgments reflecting £30 million in improper fees. Why, then, did the British government let HSBC off the hook for just £4 million?
I have reported the FCA to the Serious Fraud Office because I believe, again, there's collusion. And I think the problem that this government and HSBC have is the deferred prosecution agreement in the States, because it's a probationary order that for 5 years they have to be on best behavior. Now, if this came out during the period of the probation, it's quite possible that HSBC could lose their license in the United States. And if you remember that Osborne and the FCA pleaded with America not to prosecute, what chance is there that they're going to prosecute HSBC in its own country for a fraud on the high street? I mean, half of very well-known British stores were involved in this. John Lewis, Dixon's, Curry's, PC World, Furniture Village, a huge tranche of the high street stores in the UK were involved. So the PR would be disastrous so the government and the media. I'm not saying a conspiracy, it's a mindset that they do not report this because it's too damaging for HSBC.
What's more, based on Wilson's calculations, the court judgments is just the tip of the iceberg. As a rule, only 1 in 5 customers in arrears were taken to court, which means there are probably another 400,000 British customers who were in arrears of their accounts, were not taken to court, but were pursued by HSBC solicitors and assessed improper fees. Wilson estimates that the total improper fees assessed were close to £200 million. Not all of these charges would have been paid by consumers, but Wilson estimates 80 to 100 million pounds were paid and should be refunded. This is redress that HSBC is not interested in paying, let alone interest, let alone any penalties that might be assessed for continuing the practice for 6 years after Wilson told HSBC the charges were wrong. Many of the claims are small. Many of the claimants are poor and voiceless. HSBC is rich and powerful and a national asset. HSBC is apparently hoping to minimize awareness of its liabilities for the improper fees with the help of the British government and media and drag this affair out for a few more years until the litigants pass on or lose hope. Mr. Wilson, does the policy of delay have anything to do with what in the United States we call a statute of limitations, that the offense, if not prosecuted within a certain period of time, becomes moot?
Yes, in the UK, the statute of limitations is 6 years, and HSBC have been relying on that. They've kept this hidden and denied it for so long. And recently, I've helped a woman to reclaim charges. She's owed about £3,500, and the bank have written back to her and saying, "I'm sorry, you're out of time. It's over 6 years, so we can't look at it." But the fact is that the statute of limitation, because it's fraud, there is no statute in fraud. But also, it could be argued that the time limit of 6 years only runs from the date she discovered that the charges were illegal. And she says she discovered when she read a Guardian article about me. So I don't think they're going to be able to get away with that argument, really.
So, Mr. Wilson, you're still pursuing HSBC over their actions, and you are organizing or attempting to organize some sort of what we call in the United States a class action suit, where consumers as a group can pursue their claims against HSBC. Is that correct?
I'm talking to a couple of firms of solicitors now with a view to taking out the class action. In the UK, we call it a group action. It's slightly different to your class action, but group action is the best course for people to recover their money, because we can then get an order against the bank to produce their records.
If I understand the British group actions correctly, the consumers need to opt in. That means they have to have awareness of the case, and they need to actively seek out a solicitor, in order to prosecute their case as part of the group. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, the law has changed recently, and we are now going to be able to take class actions in specific kinds of consumer claims, but it probably wouldn't apply to this one. But in the UK, people have to see. That's why publicity is important in this case, because people need to know they've been ripped off so that they can join the class action. So it's up to the solicitors to promote and to advertise the class action once they've got the order from the court. So people, people have to join. Otherwise, we could if it was like the American system, we could sue on behalf of everybody, whether we know their names or not. But we'll get over that hurdle.
So if people want to help out, help publicize the HSBC case, one thing they can do is circulate this video. Another thing they can do is they can visit Mr. Ethical, your website, where you are posting information on the progress of the case. Mr. Wilson, what insight have you gained from your 14 years of struggle with HSBC?
Well, it's ruined my life. They're much more powerful than me, and all the, all the corruption that's gone on in the regulators and Parliament. I've lost everything as a result of this. And my public position now in financial cases is not to blow the whistle, because in the UK it's different to in the US. You've got the SEC in the US, the Securities Exchange Commission, is much more powerful than the Financial Conduct Authority here. Your fines against banks are massive. And in the States, as you will know, a whistleblower can retrieve a percentage of any damage or any fine that is ordered against the bank. In this case, that doesn't happen. David Cameron made the head of the bank a lord. I mean, the crooks in the UK are rewarded by positions in Parliament or the House of Lords, or given knighthoods or whatever. The whistleblower is persecuted in the UK. And is not celebrated. So, I mean, unless it's a matter of life or death in a hospital or a building site, my position is not to blow the whistle in financial crimes, to move away from the damage and live your life in the best way you can.
As members of the Newsbud community know well, it takes a special person to be a whistleblower, one who is willing to sacrifice years or even decades of his or her life and financial and personal well-being to bring the truth to light. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, and good luck.
Thank you for all your support, Peter.